I am deeply aware of this great inheritance and of the duties and heavy responsibilities of sovereignty, which have now passed to me.
They are gone. Diana's jewels, £4.7 million worth, vanished from a royal vault. And the police just knocked on the door of the one person nobody expected, Queen Camilla's own daughter. Laura Lopes thought nobody was watching. She was wrong. Buckingham Palace has reported the unthinkable.
The ability to have somebody who is kind of epitomizes what you think your country stands for has always been a major.
And what investigators found when they arrived at her home will leave you speechless. The royal family is in full meltdown. Catherine is furious, and the secret that Laura has been hiding for years is finally about to come out. You are not ready for this. There are moments in the life of any institution when something small, a routine check, a standard procedure, an ordinary Tuesday morning, suddenly stops being ordinary. This was one of those moments. It did not begin with a phone call to the press. It did not begin with a statement from a palace spokesperson or a carefully worded release drafted by the communications team at Buckingham Palace. It began the way most genuinely significant things begin inside the walls of the British royal family, quietly, internally, and with a deliberate effort to keep it that way for as long as humanly possible. A scheduled inventory, that is all it was supposed to be. The kind of administrative process that happens regularly within royal institutions, part of the ongoing effort to account for, preserve, and protect one of the most significant collections of jewels, art, and personal artifacts in the world. Staff trained for exactly this kind of work. People who have spent years handling items of extraordinary value with the kind of care and precision the job demands, moving methodically through the process the way they always do. Checking, cross-referencing, logging. And then, at some point during that process, something did not match. The first instinct in a situation like this is always to assume human error. A mislabeled item, a piece moved to a different location for cleaning or display, a documentation gap that someone forgot to update. These things happen, even in institutions as meticulous as the royal household. So the initial response was not panic, it was a second look, then a third. Then a conversation between two members of staff that started as a quiet question and ended as something considerably more serious. The items that could not be accounted for were not minor pieces. They were not decorative objects of modest sentimental value or jewels from a lesser corner of the collection. The pieces in question were directly tied to the legacy of Princess Diana, and their combined estimated value has since been reported at approximately £4.7 million. Among them, according to sources familiar with the matter, were pieces that anyone with even a passing knowledge of Diana's public life would recognize immediately. The pearl choker that Diana wore on multiple high-profile occasions, a piece that became as visually associated with her as almost anything else she owned, and the Qatar pearl earrings, gifted to Diana and worn by her in photographs that remain among the most reproduced images of her entire public life. To understand why the disappearance of these specific pieces carries a weight that goes far beyond their financial value, you need to understand what they represent and what instructions have been left regarding them. Queen Elizabeth II, before her passing in September 2022, had been explicit. Certain items from Diana's personal collection were not simply to pass into the general royal inventory. They were designated with intent to remain within what staff and family members have referred to as the Wales bloodline. Specifically, they were meant for Princess Catherine, William's wife, and for their daughter Princess Charlotte, who would one day be old enough to wear and carry forward the visual memory of the grandmother she never got to meet. These were not vague wishes. They were understood within the family and within the household as something considerably closer to instruction. That context is everything, because it transforms what might otherwise be framed as a missing property case into something with a much sharper edge. These were not simply valuable objects that had gone astray. They were objects with a designated future, a named recipient, a specific meaning, and a clear line of intended inheritance that someone, somewhere, had disrupted. The internal investigation that followed the initial discovery moved quickly. This is not the kind of situation where the palace takes its time. Access records were reviewed, staff movements were examined, The timeline of when the items had last been definitively confirmed present was reconstructed as carefully as possible. All of this happened before a single word reached the press, before any external agency was contacted, before the story existed anywhere beyond a very small number of people operating under enormous pressure inside one of the most scrutinized institutions on Earth. What investigators were trying to establish in those early hours was a straightforward question with a deeply complicated answer. Who had access to these items, and when? Royal collections of this kind are not casually accessible. There are protocols around them, layers of authorization, physical security measures, and documentation requirements that are designed specifically to prevent exactly this kind of situation. And yet the situation had occurred, which meant that whatever had happened, it had not happened by accident, and it had not happened without at least some degree of access that was either legitimate on the surface or had been made to appear that way. The more the internal team worked through what they knew, the more a name began to surface in the conversations happening behind closed doors. Not because of any direct evidence confirmed publicly at that stage, but because of proximity, because of access, and because of a set of circumstances that, when placed alongside each other, pointed in a direction that no one inside the palace was comfortable with. Laura Lopes, Camilla's daughter, a woman who had spent her adult life cultivating precisely the kind of low profile that the rest of the royal family so often struggles to maintain. An art curator by profession, deeply familiar with the handling, valuation, and movement of significant objects. A woman who, by virtue of her mother's position, had a level of access to royal spaces and occasions that very few people outside the immediate family could claim. And a woman who, in the weeks and months prior to this discovery, had been present at a number of private family gatherings where the items in question could, in theory, have been within reach. None of this, it needs to be said clearly, amounted to proof. An investigation of this nature does not move on proximity alone, and it should not. But it moved far enough, and with enough consistency in the direction it was pointing, that the decision was eventually made to take the matter outside the palace's internal process. That decision, the decision to contact the police, is not one that the royal household makes lightly. In fact, it is almost without precedent in the modern era. The palace has always had a strong and understandable preference for handling its internal difficulties internally. The idea of uniformed officers arriving at the home of someone connected, however indirectly, to the royal family represents exactly the kind of public exposure that the institution's communications operation exists to prevent. The fact that this call was made anyway tells you everything you need to know about how seriously the disappearance of these items was being taken. Because this was not simply about money, though £4.7 million is not a figure anyone dismisses. It was not simply about jewelry, however beautiful or historically significant those pieces might be. It was about what those items meant. It was about a dead princess whose memory remains one of the most powerful and emotionally charged forces in British public life, more than 2 decades after her death. It was about a set of instructions left by a queen who had spent 70 years holding her family and her institution together. And it was about the question of whether those instructions had been deliberately, knowingly, and very quietly ignored. By the time the police were brought in, the story had already moved beyond the palace's ability to contain it. Word travels fast in the circles where this kind of news lives. And within hours of the first officers making their way toward a private home in the English countryside, the questions that the palace had been trying to keep inside its walls were already beginning to find their way out. There is a particular kind of visibility that comes with being connected to the British royal family without technically being a member of it. You are close enough to the institution to feel its weight in every room you walk into, close enough for the press to know your name and your face, close enough that your movements and your choices carry a significance that most private citizens never have to think about. But you are also at the same time just far enough outside the formal structure that you have no protection from it, no communications team working on your behalf, no protocol designed to manage your public image or shield you from scrutiny when scrutiny arrives. That is the world Laura Lopes has navigated for her entire adult life. And it is a world that, until very recently, she had managed with a degree of skill that deserves more credit than it typically receives. Laura Rose Parker Bowles was born on the 1st of January, 1978. the second child of Camilla and her then-husband Andrew Parker Bowles, a retired British Army officer. She grew up at Bolhide Manor, an 8-bedroom country estate in Wiltshire with a swimming pool, tennis courts, and 70 acres of land. It was a privileged childhood by any measure, but it was also one shadowed, from relatively early on, by the particular complications of her family's story. Her parents divorced in 1995, the same year that the now famous Panorama interview with Princess Diana aired, and the entire architecture of the royal family's private life began collapsing very publicly into view. Laura was 17 years old. The world she had grown up in was changing in ways that were deeply personal to her family, and the changes were playing out on the front pages of every newspaper in the country. She was educated at St. Mary's Shaftesbury, a Catholic girls' boarding school in Dorset, and later at Oxford Brookes University, where she studied history of art and marketing. That combination tells you something about who Laura is and what she was drawn to. She is not someone who gravitated toward politics or public life, or the kind of high-profile career that invites attention. She moved, instead, toward the world of art, a world that rewards a sharp eye, a genuine understanding of value and context, and the kind of careful, considered judgment that does not announce itself. She became an art curator. She built a career that was respected within its field and almost entirely invisible outside of it. That was, by all available evidence, entirely intentional. In 2006, she married Harry Lopes, a model who had worked with Calvin Klein and who came from his own background of quiet English privilege. His grandfather was Massey Lopes, the second Baron Roberot, and the family has long-standing ties to properties including Naton Hall in Devon and the Skelpick Estate in the Scottish Highlands. Their wedding reception was held at Ray Mill House in Wiltshire, Camilla's beloved countryside retreat, the property she had purchased in the mid-90s following her divorce and used as her private sanctuary for years. The choice of location was significant in the way that family choices often are, marking the occasion with a sense of continuity and belonging that the public circumstances of Laura's childhood had not always made easy to come by. Together, Laura and Harry have 3 children, their daughter Eliza and twin sons Gus and Louis. Eliza, now in her mid-teens, was chosen as a bridesmaid at Prince William and Catherine's wedding in 2011, a moment that placed this otherwise private family briefly and visibly inside one of the most watched events in modern British history. Gus and Louis appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace during King Charles's coronation in 2023 in their roles as pages of honor, an appearance that again brought the Lopes family into the frame of a major royal occasion, however briefly. These moments of visibility are telling precisely because of how few of them there are. Laura has spent the better part of 3 decades watching her mother occupy one of the most scrutinized positions in British public life, and she has responded to that proximity by doing almost everything possible to avoid occupying a similar position herself. She has not written books, she has not given interviews, she does not maintain a visible social media presence. She attends select royal occasions. She fulfills whatever informal obligations come with being the daughter of a queen consort, and then she returns to a life that is, by the standards of everyone around her, remarkably ordinary. But ordinary is a relative term when your mother is Queen Camilla, and the history between your family and the family you are now loosely connected to by marriage and occasion is as charged as this one. The tension between Laura and Prince William is not something that has been widely aired, but it is something that has been documented. According to royal biographer Katie Nicholl, writing in her 2010 book about William and Harry, the two of them clashed more than once over their parents' relationship in the years following Charles and Camilla's marriage in 2005. William, still carrying the grief of losing his mother and the particular anger that comes with watching the woman your father chose to love become a permanent fixture in public life, would sometimes direct that anger in ways that touched the people around Camilla. Laura, fiercely protective of her mother, was not someone who absorbed that quietly. She reportedly told William directly, at some point during that difficult period, that his father had ruined her life. It was the kind of thing that, once said, does not entirely disappear. It sits in the room long after the conversation has ended. By all accounts, the relationship between Laura and William eventually settled into something more functional. The presence of Eliza as a flower girl at William's wedding is one indication of that. The ongoing inclusion of Gus and Louis in coronation proceedings is another. These are not gestures made toward people the family genuinely cannot stand, but functional is not the same as warm, and the history is still there, underneath whatever surface arrangements have been made. What makes Laura's position particularly complicated in the context of what is now unfolding is not just her personal history with the Wales family or her proximity to occasions where significant royal objects were present. It is also the professional dimension that tends to get overlooked in the more sensational coverage. Laura Lopes is, by training and by career, someone who understands objects. She understands their provenance, their value, their market, and the way in which items of significant worth move through private hands. She has spent her professional life inside a world where the authentication and valuation of rare and important pieces is a daily concern. That expertise cuts two ways. It is the kind of background that makes someone extremely well equipped to handle items of extraordinary value responsibly and professionally. It is also, and this cannot be ignored now that questions are being asked, the kind of background that would give someone a very clear understanding of what certain pieces are worth and how their movement might be managed. There is one further development that has quietly added to the picture forming around Laura's circumstances in the period leading up to the palace's discovery. In early 2026, land registry documents revealed that Camilla's Ray Mill house in Wiltshire, the property valued at approximately £850,000, where Laura and Harry had held their wedding reception 2 decades earlier, had been transferred out of Camilla's name. The new registered owners were Harry Lopes, Laura's husband, and a financier named Jake Irwin, who reportedly represents Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son. The transfer was discreet, no announcement was made. The documents simply appeared in the public record, as land registry documents do, and were noticed by those who were paying attention. On its own, a parent transferring property to their children is not unusual or sinister. It happens in families across the country every day for entirely straightforward reasons, including estate planning and tax considerations. But the timing of this particular transfer, placed alongside the questions now being asked about missing items from the royal collection, has contributed to a broader sense among those following the story that there is a pattern of movement within this family that is worth understanding more clearly. Whether that pattern leads anywhere consequential is something only the investigation can determine, but the investigation is already underway, and Laura Lopes, the woman who spent her life carefully staying out of the story, now finds herself at the very center of it. The decision to send police officers to a private address connected to the royal family is not made over a cup of tea. It is not made quickly, and it is not made without a significant amount of internal discussion about what the consequences of that decision will be, both for the investigation itself and for the institution that has, however reluctantly, concluded that an investigation is necessary. The palace's preference, in virtually every situation involving family members or people close to the family, is to handle things within its own walls. That preference is not simply about protecting reputations, though it is certainly about that too. It is about the fundamental understanding, built into the palace's way of operating over centuries, that the moment an external agency becomes involved, control of the narrative shifts, and once it shifts, it very rarely shifts back. So when the decision was made to contact the police, it was made with a clear awareness of what that step meant. It meant that the matter had moved beyond what any internal process could adequately address. It meant that the items in question, their value, their significance, and the circumstances of their disappearance had reached a threshold that the palace's own investigative capacity could not responsibly handle alone. And it meant that whatever came next was going to be considerably harder to contain than what had come before. The officers who made their way into Laura Lopes's home did not arrive with sirens. This was not that kind of visit. It was measured, it was deliberate, and by all accounts it was conducted with the kind of discretion that these situations demand, at least in their opening stages. But discretion only goes so far when police vehicles are parked outside a private address and officers are seen entering a property. The neighborhood notices. People talk. And in an age where information travels faster than any palace communications team can manage, the story was already beginning to move before the initial visit had even concluded. What the officers were looking for, and what they may or may not have found during that first visit, has not been fully confirmed in any official statement. That is not unusual. Active? Investigations of this nature are not narrated in real time by the agencies conducting them. What is known is that the visit took place, that it was directly connected to the palace's report of the missing items, and that Laura Lopes was, at that point, the individual whose name had been most consistently surfacing in the internal conversations that preceded the decision to escalate. It is worth being precise about what that means and what it does not mean. Being the subject of a police inquiry at this stage is not the same as being charged with anything. It is not the same as having been found guilty of anything. Investigations begin with questions, and questions are directed at the people who are most likely to have answers. Laura's proximity to the relevant occasions, her professional background in the handling and valuation of significant objects, and the broader set of circumstances that had already drawn internal attention toward her were enough to make her the logical starting point for an investigation that, in truth, had barely begun. But logic and lived experience are two different things, and for Laura Lopes, a woman who had spent her entire adult life avoiding exactly this kind of exposure, the arrival of police at her door was not simply a procedural development in an ongoing inquiry. It was the moment that everything she had carefully constructed around her private life came into direct and very public contact with the institution she had always existed at the edge of. The response from inside the palace to the developments unfolding at Laura's address was, by the standards of the institution, swift. William and Catherine were informed early. That much appears clear from the timeline of events as it has been pieced together by those familiar with the situation. And their response, while not publicly stated, reflects something important about where the two of them now stand, not just as members of the royal family, but as the people most directly affected by what has gone missing. Catherine's connection to the items in question is not abstract. These were pieces designated for her: Diana's pearl choker, the Qatar pearl earrings, objects that carry not just financial value, but an emotional weight that is almost impossible to overstate for a woman who married into the family that Diana left behind, who has spent years navigating the enormously complicated task of honoring Diana's memory while building her own identity within the same institution. Catherine had known that these pieces were intended for her. She had known that Queen Elizabeth II had been explicit about their destination, and she had known, presumably, that they were being kept safely and that the chain of custody around them was something the household took seriously. To discover that the chain had broken, that the pieces were gone, and that the investigation was pointing in the direction it was pointing, towards someone connected directly to Camilla, the woman, whose relationship with Charles had defined so much of Diana's unhappiness in the final years of her life, was not simply upsetting in a personal sense. It was, for Catherine, a collision between the most painful parts of the family's history and the present moment she had worked so hard to stabilize. William's response runs alongside that, but with its own particular quality. He has spent years managing the emotional complexity of being the son of both Charles and Diana, of being connected by blood and circumstance to every fault line the family has ever had to navigate. His relationship with Laura Lopes has history, as has already been established. The clashes of their younger years, the difficult period following his parents' respective marriages, the slow and incomplete reconciliation that followed. None of that goes away simply because time passes and public appearances suggest a working relationship. It sits beneath the surface, and situations like this one have a way of bringing buried things back up. What William appears to have done, in the immediate aftermath of being informed, is what he increasingly does in situations of institutional pressure. He focused on the process, on ensuring that the investigation had what it needed, that the palace's cooperation with the police was complete and documented, and that the communications around the situation were handled in a way that was measured without being dismissive of the seriousness involved. This is a version of William that has been gradually coming into focus over recent years, someone who manages crises with a composure that is less about suppressing emotion and more about channeling it into action. And then there is Camilla. Her position in all of this is perhaps the most complicated of anyone's, and that is saying something given the cast of characters involved. Camilla has already, in the period leading up to this development, been navigating a significant shift in her own standing within the institution. The question of what she knew and when she knew it is one that the investigation will inevitably need to address, even if only to rule it out. A mother and a daughter have a relationship. They talk. They share information about their lives, their circumstances, their concerns. The idea that Camilla would have been entirely unaware of any difficulties in Laura's situation, financial or otherwise, requires a degree of credulity that the people closest to this story are finding increasingly difficult to extend. What has been observed by those around her is a woman who, in the days following the police visit to Laura's address, has retreated further into the carefully managed stillness that has become her primary mode of public presentation. She has appeared where she was required to appear. She has said what she was required to say. But the warmth, always a performance to some degree, has become thinner. The eyes tell a story that the composed expression is working very hard to contradict. The question of whether Camilla had any knowledge of what may have happened to the missing items is one that cannot be answered here, because it has not yet been answered by the investigation. But the question is being asked. Loudly, in the corridors of the palace, and more quietly but no less seriously, by the officers now working to establish exactly how £4.7 million worth of royal heirlooms, pieces tied directly to the memory of the most beloved member of the family this institution has ever produced, came to disappear from a vault they were never supposed to leave. There is a particular cruelty in the way that scandals involving the British royal family tend to resolve themselves. They rarely end cleanly. There is no single moment where the curtain comes down. The truth is established beyond doubt, and everyone involved is able to move forward with a clear understanding of what happened and why. Instead, what tends to happen is a long, slow settling, a gradual process in which certain facts become impossible to deny, certain relationships become impossible to repair, and the institution itself absorbs another scar and continues moving forward because that is ultimately what it has always done. That process is now underway. And the question is not simply what the investigation will find. The question is what the royal family and the British public that has watched this institution through every crisis it has ever faced will be left with when the dust finally settles. The formal investigation into the missing heirlooms is ongoing. Police inquiries of this nature do not move at the pace of a news cycle, and they should not. They move at the pace that careful, methodical evidence gathering requires, which means that definitive answers may still be some way off. But the investigation's existence alone, the simple fact that officers have visited Laura Lopes' home in connection with a report filed by the palace, has already set off a chain of consequences that no outcome of the inquiry will be able to fully reverse. For Laura herself, the consequences are the most immediate and the most personal. She built her adult life around a very deliberate kind of invisibility. She made choices, consistently and over decades, that kept her name out of the headlines and her face out of the frame. She understood, perhaps better than anyone in her position, that visibility in connection with the royal family is almost never straightforwardly positive, that the press attention that surrounds the institution has a way of consuming the people it touches, regardless of whether those people have done anything to deserve it, and so, she stayed quiet, stayed private, stayed out. That strategy has now collapsed entirely. Her name is attached to a story that combines two of the most reliably combustible elements in British public life, the royal family and the memory of Princess Diana. The combination is not one that fades quickly or forgives easily. Diana's legacy occupies a place in the British cultural consciousness that remains, more than 25 years after her death, extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily sensitive. Any story that touches it, particularly one that involves the suggestion that objects belonging to her were removed from a royal vault without authorization, carries an emotional charge that goes far beyond the financial value of the items themselves. The British public's relationship with Diana's memory is not something that can be neatly summarized, but it can be understood in terms of its intensity. When Catherine appeared in public wearing certain pieces from Diana's collection, the response was invariably one of deep emotion. There is a feeling, widely held and genuinely felt, that Diana's belongings, her jewels in particular, are not simply objects. They are a form of continued presence. They are the physical traces of a woman who was taken too soon and who has never stopped being missed. The idea that any of those pieces might have been taken, that the explicit wishes of Queen Elizabeth II regarding their future might have been overridden, strikes at something that many people feel very personally, even those who have no direct connection to the family whatsoever. It is that emotional dimension, layered on top of the legal and institutional dimensions, that makes this situation so particularly difficult for the palace to manage. A missing object worth £4.7 million is a serious matter. A missing object worth £4.7 million that belonged to Princess Diana and was designated for her daughter-in-law and granddaughter is something of an entirely different order. It is a story about grief, about legacy, about whether the most powerful family in the country is capable of protecting the memory of the woman it failed so comprehensively while she was alive. Within the palace, the communications team is facing one of its more complex challenges in recent memory. The instinct, as always, is to say as little as possible for as long as possible, but silence in this case carries its own risks. The story is already in circulation. The police visit to Laura's address has been noted and reported. The connection between the investigation and the missing items has been established. In that environment, a palace that says nothing risks appearing either complicit or indifferent, neither of which is a position the institution can afford given the specific nature of what is allegedly missing. What the palace appears to have settled on, at least in the short term, is the kind of carefully maintained non-response that it has deployed in previous difficult situations, acknowledging that a matter is being looked into without providing any detail that might further complicate an active police investigation. It is a defensible position legally, but it is one that satisfies almost no one emotionally, and in a situation where emotional resonance is everything, that gap is a significant problem. William and Catherine's public engagements have continued through this period. That is itself a statement. The decision to maintain the rhythm of their public schedule, to appear at the events they were already committed to be seen carrying out their duties with the composure and steadiness that has come to define their public image, is a deliberate one. It communicates, without saying anything explicitly, that the institution is stable, that its future is secure, and that the people who represent that future are not going to be derailed by whatever is unfolding around them. It is the monarchy doing what the monarchy has always done in moments of difficulty, projecting continuity and calm, even when neither is particularly easy to maintain. But behind that projection, the personal dimension of what Catherine is experiencing in this period is not difficult to imagine. She has already faced more than most people could reasonably be expected to face. Her own cancer diagnosis and the recovery that followed, conducted under a level of public scrutiny that would have broken most people, demonstrated something about her character that no royal title could have established on its own. She emerged from that experience with an authority and a depth of public respect that was genuinely earned. And now, in the period following that recovery, she is dealing with the knowledge that objects meant for her, objects connected to the mother-in-law she never met, but whose shadow has shaped so much of her life within this family, are the subject of a police investigation that leads toward people in her own extended circle. The question of what this means for the relationship between the Wales family and Camilla is one that cannot yet be answered with certainty, but it is one that the people closest to the situation are already living with. Camilla's standing within the institution has been shifting for some time. The period following Charles's reduced public role has already required her to recalibrate her own position and her own purpose within the family structure. This development, regardless of what the investigation ultimately establishes, has added another layer of complication to that already difficult recalibration. What sources familiar with the situation have described is an atmosphere of profound tension between different parts of the family that is being managed, with considerable effort, beneath a surface of formal civility. The gatherings that continue to be required by protocol and tradition are happening. The necessary interactions are taking place. But the warmth, such as it was, has been replaced by something considerably more guarded, and the people who know this family well are not expecting that to change quickly, regardless of how the investigation concludes. There is also a question, one that is being asked in the circles where this story is being followed most closely, about what this situation reveals about the broader pressures facing people who exist in the orbit of the royal family without being fully protected by it. Laura Lopes never had a communications team. She never had the kind of institutional support that manages the public profile of working royals. She was close enough to the family to absorb its complications, but far enough outside it to face those complications without any of its protections. Whether that structural vulnerability played any role in whatever led to this investigation is something that only a full accounting of the facts will be able to address. But it is a dimension of the story that deserves more consideration than it is currently receiving in the more sensational coverage. The monarchy has absorbed crises before: the abdication of Edward VIII in 1936, the death of Diana in 1997, and the public fury at the royal family's initial response, the various scandals and revelations of the decades in between. Each time, the institution has adapted, adjusted, and continued. It has done so because it is extraordinarily good at the long game, at outlasting the immediate storm and emerging on the other side still recognizably itself. Whether it emerges from this situation with its relationship to Diana's memory intact is a harder question, because Diana is not simply a historical figure in the way that other royal controversies are rooted in history. She is present in the public consciousness in a way that feels almost current. Her face is still recognized everywhere. Her story is still being told, still being processed, still being felt. And the suggestion that the objects she wore and treasured, the objects that a queen specifically designated to remain within the family Diana loved and was loved by, may have been removed without authorization, is not the kind of suggestion that the British public is inclined to let go of easily. What comes next depends on what the investigation finds. If the missing items are recovered, and the circumstances of their disappearance are fully established, the palace will move swiftly to close the chapter and redirect attention toward the future. If the investigation concludes without a satisfactory resolution, the questions will continue to circulate, shaping the story the public tells itself about this family and this moment for years to come. What is already clear, regardless of how the investigation concludes, is that the world inside Buckingham Palace has shifted again. The relationships that define it, the alliances, the tensions, the careful arrangements that allow people with complicated histories to function within the same institution, have been stress-tested in a way that leaves marks. And the woman at the center of it, Laura Lopes, quiet, private, deliberate, the woman who spent her life ensuring that her name would never be the one people were searching for, is now the name that everyone wants to understand. The heirlooms may yet be found. The full truth of what happened to them may yet be established, but some things, once they have been set in motion, do not return to where they started. The trust that holds this family together, already worn thin in places by everything that has come before, has taken another blow. And in an institution where trust is ultimately the only currency that matters, that is a loss that no inventory, however carefully conducted, will ever be able to fully account for.